In case any of you were really wondering, Canada board and sailed on RMS Aquitania, 100 feet longer, 10,000 tons heavier, a deck taller, but 4 knots slower than the Mauritania.
I am being mocked, but I just threw it in for the hell of it.
My name is Yvonne Hunter, and I'm the head of programming at the Appel Salon here at the Toronto Public Library. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to our last event of the fall, capping off a spectacular season of sold-out events. Tonight, we are joined by financier, columnist, biographer, and historian Conrad Black, who brings us a brilliantly conceived re-examination of our country's history, in conversation with one of Canada's most respected journalists, Brian Stewart. Brian Stewart is one of Canada's most respected foreign correspondents. For more than 2 decades, his reports on CBC's The National provided Canadians with a window on the world. He is a Gemini Award-winning reporter with a depth of understanding gained by many years working abroad and a reputation for compassion and humanity. Throughout his reporting career, Stewart has worked extensively in conflict areas covering humanitarian crises. Brian is currently a distinguished senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Conrad Black is the author of widely acclaimed biographies of Maurice Duplessis, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Richard Nixon, and a strategic history of the United States. He was for many years the head of the Argus, Hollinger, and Telegraph newspaper groups. Mr. Black is a columnist in the National Post, which he founded, and he writes for the National Review Online and the Huffington Post. He has been a member of the British House of Lords since 2001. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Brian Stewart and Conrad Black.
Thanks very much. I will be asking some questions for about 40 minutes, then we'll go to questions from the floor. So as the evening goes on, if you think of some, you can think of some questions that would be, in fairness to everybody, very short questions, because there'll be many people lining up. And that will be in about 40 minutes' time. Ever since I've known Conrad, and that's been now 54 years, he's been somebody who's collected, who has wished to meet famous people, see famous events, record part of history. I find this hard to believe, but I'm sitting next to a man who actually knew somebody who worked with John A. Macdonald, founder of the country, who was at the Queen Elizabeth's coronation in 1953, who stood on a June morning in 1967 just below the balcony where de Gaulle proclaimed "Vive le Québec libre," and has been involved in many historical moments and has known a great many people in power, which makes some of his observations on powerful people now as a historian particularly relevant. In the opening to your book, Conrad, Paul Johnson, a very renowned intellectual and historian, British, who's written a great many histories, wrote this: "Canadian history rarely rises above a whisper. Its story is fascinating, but it is written in lowercase. Its very size underlines its character. The outstanding characteristic is silence. One must listen and listen hard, and what emerges is paradox." I get the sense that what you set out to do in this history was to unravel paradoxes by listening in areas that a lot of Canadian historians have not listened to perhaps enough. What was your singular objective in this?
I became convinced that it was, in fact, a very interesting history by a kind of backward deductive reasoning. The fact is, while Canadians are not, for the most part, accustomed to thinking of themselves in this way, and certainly we were not brought up to think of Canada in this way, it is a G7 country. It has the 11th largest GDP in the world. There are 197 countries in the world if you include Palestine, the Vatican, and Taiwan. And Canada is, by any reasonable measurement, one of the 10 or 11 most important countries in the world. And it is grown steadily from 100 Europeans milling about with the native people 400 years ago to this status it now has. And I reasoned that there must be a greater story to this than those of us who were taught Canadian history in the school system were given to understand. And so I looked into it more and more thoroughly, and I gradually satisfied myself that indeed it is a very interesting story, and that it has seemed to be, as Paul Johnson described, because you see, as you know, Brian, you've lived overseas for a good part of your life. From a distance, it is very difficult for foreigners, even relatively knowledgeable ones like the British, to make a distinction between English-speaking Canadians and Americans from northern states. And because Canada is a relatively well-organized and it's hard for us to believe it sometimes, but relatively well-governed country, it is rather indistinct, and especially in comparison to this tremendously powerful country next to us. And I, without wishing to be bumptious about it or do anything un-Canadian or urge us to be braggarts or show-offs or anything like that, I just wanted to extract the secret to Canadian success because it has been an extremely successful country.
And in doing this, you concentrate heavily to the discomfort of perhaps a couple of reviewers on leadership. And it's the leaders you concentrate on because you write early on that there lies a theme and a golden thread to the Canadian story, that most of the good leaders with a sense of history, even if subconsciously it's there, they've known what that great theme was meant to be.
Exactly. You see, my theory as it emerged, I didn't have it until I studied the subject enough for it to develop. It came upon me as I got through the material, was that at each stage, from Champlain, the founder of Quebec, to recent times, there have been watershed moments, and we made in general the right choice because statesmen did the right thing, often very innovatively and often very courageously. And in this very place, a year and a half ago, when the library was kind enough to have me to discuss my history of the United States, even such a predestined country as that, such a powerful country as that, the same can be said. In the case of the United States, it isn't just that they had the middle of this continent and the English language and the democratic tradition. They need not have been a more important or powerful country than Brazil. Now, Brazil is an important country, but it's not the United States. It became what it became because of its leaders. And the same is true in Canada, even though the leadership style is different.
One of the leaders, which I think is we've long overlooked in recent years, you got into very heavily, is Samuel de Champlain, who emerges in your book a towering figure of his time, not just in these small villages in Canada that he, or not even villages, but camps, but in fact in the courts of Europe. I had no idea of that.
Very well regarded by Richelieu, who was rivaled only by Bismarck as the greatest statesman in the history of continental Europe, who was an enthusiast about Canada as an idea. It's a great...
Richelieu.
Yeah, it's a great legitimization of the whole concept.
He wasn't the one that called it a bunch of acres of snow?
That was Voltaire.
Ah.
But on the contrary, he believed in the whole idea of a new France. But yes, Champlain was a very remarkable man. He was a great navigator. He crossed the Atlantic 33 times. He never learned to swim, strangely enough.
33 times,
yes.
In what year span again? This would be
between 1600 and 1634.
I mean, crossing it once was a big 30.
And he did it once in, let me get this right. I did it once in 20 days, which is absolutely astonishing. It's only 4 times as long as the great liners of memory of many people here, the Queen Mary and the Normandy and ships like that did.
By the way, if many of you don't know much about the great liners, if you read this book, you will certainly learn about it, because every crossing of the ocean where a great liner is has encountered, you will get the details.
That is because Samuel Cunard was a Canadian, and I made the most of our great Canadians, and he was one of them.
But Champlain was absolutely remarkable, much more so than I think we learned ever in school. But getting to the Canadian theme and story, what is striking in your book is the narrowness of the way somehow we get a keen perspective or perceptive sense of how to get through narrow survival.
Yes.
You mentioned the point that how the necessity of the French being here first. Could you run through the balancing act as geopoliticians before the term came along? We needed?
Exactly. Look, you can start from the premise, which is perfectly true, that anyone who inhabits Canada should do well. It's a rich country. The climate's a bit severe, and tonight is something of an example of it. But it's a rich country, and so we should do well. But you can say the same of Argentina and so on. But the fact is, creating a political society here was not like falling off a log. And as Brian says, we had to start with the French, and they had to become self-sufficient. What is now Quebec had to be self-sufficient because no one else was going to supply it, and even the French themselves weren't terribly enthused about supplying it. And it did become self-sufficient thanks to Jean Talon chiefly, and who I regard as the C.D. Howe of the 17th century. If it wasn't French, it would have been taken over by the Americans, whether as British colonists or as independent Americans. And then it had to pass out of French control because France could not contest with Britain for control of the Atlantic Ocean. It had a greater army, but a smaller navy. And then the Americans had to cease to be British, or the British would have accepted an American absorption of French Canada. And in ceasing to be British, the Americans had to drive a significant number of English-speaking Americans out of the United States, out of loyalty to Britain, to give Britain an incentive to keep the whole entity north of the United States going. And I had the privilege of saying here a year and a half ago, it was a great achievement for the Americans as colonists to persuade the British to evict the French from Canada, and then for Benjamin Franklin to persuade the French to help the Americans evict the British from the United States as it became. It was a tremendous triumph for these colonists to manipulate the two greatest powers in the world. But it was no less of an achievement, if a less dramatic one, for the Canadians, English and French, to work it out between them tolerably well and win their independence from the British without so aggravating the British that the British ceased to protect Canada from the Americans. Even if we'd wished to here, we couldn't stage a revolution, because if we'd thrown the British out, the Americans would have taken us over. And so it was a very complicated thing.
I think you call it the complexity of the Canadian minuet.
Yeah.
With the natives played an important role.
May I say one thing about Champlain in this regard? In 1628, there were these frequent wars between France and Britain, and at one point, the British actually laid siege to Quebec in 1628, and Champlain got through the siege, and then in 1629, he was waiting to be resupplied. The British couldn't win unless they could starve him out, and the British stopped the French resupply fleet in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and finally, he waited until they literally had nothing to eat, nothing, and no ammunition. So they simply couldn't go on. And then he bluffed his way into quite a respectable handing over. And his theory was that there was a good chance by that time that the war would actually be over in Europe and the peace signed between the British and French, in which case the surrender would be invalid. And he was right by a couple of months. But it was only that tenacity that preserved New France. The British had to give New France back to France. And Champlain came back one more time for another 6 years as the governor. But it was by a hair's breadth.
He had a remarkable relationship with the native community in Canada, the Aboriginals. And really
magnificent. He understood and respected them and always was very interested in them and not a bit condescending. And I put in my book that there was not another Canadian leader until John Diefenbaker who seriously respected the Indians, so-called Indians. I'm not suggesting that previous prime ministers were disparaging to them. They were not. I mean, Sir John Macdonald had the support of some of the prominent chiefs and so on, and these were all reasonable, civilized men. They had nothing against the native people at all, but they weren't actively interested in them, and Mr. Diefenbaker was, and Champlain was.
I think you're right. Diefenbaker was the first leader in almost half a millennium to show the kind of respect that Champlain did naturally. It's a quite astonishing.
Well, I do not think that Mr. Diefenbaker was a successful prime minister.
Yeah.
I think he was a wonderful and entirely admirable man at his respect for all the disadvantaged, all the underdogs, all the ethnic groups, all the minorities, all the accused, everyone who got a short straw. He was automatically their advocate all his life.
We need, because of the vastness of the tableau here, to move on. But Sir John A. Macdonald, again, you knew somebody who actually worked with him for a while, which is quite remarkable.
Well, an old friend of Duplessis, who was well into his 90s when I met him in 1970. And he, as a very young man, he was a poll worker for him in Three Rivers, Quebec.
So everybody in this room, I'm sure, would buy the notion that Sir John A. Macdonald was a great man. But even at that, he seems to come across greater than, every time you read anew about him, he seems to be even greater. Were you astonished?
I was astonished. I mean, we all knew, and we're all brought up in this country to look upon him with great respect. But I did not realize until I got into this, and it's no great credit to me that I didn't realize it. I can't blame it on my teachers, although most of them weren't very good. But Canada is the only transcontinental, officially bicultural, parliamentary confederation in the history of the world. Now, that may sound like an inconsequential statement, but it's been going for 147 years. Of the other G7 countries to which I referred, only the British and the Americans have had the same system for that long. It's a venerable system, and it has its imperfections, as every Canadian knows, but it has worked. And he basically invented it, not him alone, but it was essentially he was the chief inventor and chief driving initiator of it, and he kept it going as the political leader of the country for 25 years after that, including some terribly difficult times. He knew there had to be a railroad to tie the whole country together, and it was an amazingly ambitious project. We had no public finance market in this country, unlike the Americans, who had the most sophisticated capital markets in the world at that time already, and we had to build the railway over the Canadian Shield. I mean, the Americans built their transcontinental railways, but straight across the Great Plains until they got to the Rockies. We had to build, I mean, all of you, or most of you, have been over, along the north shore of Lake Superior. It's not very hospitable country to lay a railroad. And we did it, and we had to raise the money from outside the country, and it was terribly difficult, and terribly difficult politically. And in the midst of it, there was an annexationist move that fused with the Second Riel Rebellion, and the railway was essentially bankrupt, and he refinanced the railway as a national defense and security measure to put down the rebellion, the genius resolution of one crisis by dealing with the other crisis, and it all worked. He put down the rebellion. The railway made money from the first 3 months it was operating completely, and he was reelected two more times.
Do you think under him, had a lesser leader, Canada might have still been lost to the United States in that era?
Well, the central part of it. I think the British would have made it clear they would not tolerate the Americans. And this is 1885, and the United States, at the end of the Civil War, had the greatest army in the world and the greatest generals in the world, but they didn't want a war with Great Britain. They would have had all of their coastal cities, Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf of Mexico, shelled for as long as it pleased the British to do it. The Royal Navy, had the scepter of the seas, but the British would have not tolerated the takeover of Ontario and Quebec. But I don't think they would have gone to war with the United States over Manitoba and Saskatchewan.
So he held it together. He was known as, in remarkable feats. You record once when, to save his career, he spoke in the House of Commons without a single note for 5 hours.
With a hangover.
I mean, you know, what leader today would we like to put forward to speak for 5 hours with a hangover? But he gained an affection, despite his rascal nature at times, that was known throughout Canada and Europe. He was an amazing international figure.
Yes, yes, very respected. Disraeli wrote to a lady friend of his, of Macdonald staying with him at his home, and how impressed he was with him. And Disraeli, I mean, he was a very courteous man for political reasons, but he didn't exactly shower compliments around. He wasn't overly impressed with too many statesmen, you know, starting with his chief opponent, Mr. Gladstone. And he was full of praise for Macdonald. Abraham Lincoln thought very highly of him. He only met him once, I think.
Well, I was very struck years ago when I read the funeral arrangements around so many places when he died. And it was very moving and touching how people felt. I want to give people a sense of the style of your writing and areas. If you could read this one paragraph, this takes place just after Sir John has died. And the British Empire is shocked. And then Canadians are obviously deeply moved.
Many of you will remember Peter Zosky. His grandfather, Sir Casimir Zosky, laid a wreath on Sir John's chest in his open casket with the card, "With sadness, respect, and gratitude, Victoria, Queen and Empress." The quote that Brian has asked me to read is his in the sentence I'm about to utter is Sir John A. Macdonald. "Every engine on his transcontinental railway was draped in black and purple, including the one that pulled the funeral train to Kingston. Thousands more conducted him to City Hall, and the next day to join his family in Cataraqui Cemetery, near the site of the fort built by Frontenac more than 2 centuries before, in ground overlooking where the Great Lakes funnel into the St. Lawrence for the mighty broadening surge to the Atlantic Ocean. Canada was alone without the great man who had assembled it, bound it together with immense diplomacy and cunning between all the regional and factional pressures inherent to the country, and between the foibles and sinister traits of appetite and indifference of which the American and British governments were always capable. He had consummated the long struggle for national life with a successful start, and had guided the new and gangling country along the path of early nationhood. John Alexander Macdonald had been brilliant and unerring at critical moments. Confederation, completing the railway, avoiding commercial union with the United States, preserving relations between the founding races. He had dominated the public life of his country for nearly 2 whole generations, since the great ministry of Baldwin and LaFontaine. Even in the era of Lincoln, Bismarck, Disraeli, and Gladstone, he was a great statesman. His work was far from over, but now someone would have to take his place."
It's pretty good. And that someone almost magically, when you think back on it, turns out to be the next great man of the hour is, of course,
Wilfrid Laurier. They overlapped for 4 years as party leaders.
They ruled for something like 43 years, or was it? Or I forget the.
Well, the party leader from 1856, before Confederation, when Macdonald really founded the Conservative Party in the so-called United Province of Canada, which was 80% of Canadians at the time, to Sir Wilfrid dying in 1919. So between the two, 63 years, of which 43 were as head of the government.
43 years as head of the government. I mean, there's what?
And by the way, Laurier was followed directly by Mr. King, leader of the Liberal Party for 29 years, 22 as Prime Minister. There's that astonishing record of those 3 men back-to-back, 92 years, between them 65 years in government.
We have to realize this just is not replicated anywhere else really in the world. Any democracy is, and the Liberal Party merges later, we'll get to that later, but merges most probably the most successful democratic political party in the world.
From 1896, the first election of Sir Wilfrid, to Paul Martin retiring in 2006, 110 years, the Liberal Party governed for 80 years. There's nothing like it in any democratic country.
And it was an interesting period, no, more than interesting, to say the least, but it was an era when clearly we had leaders who had great vision. Not only, they had two things that seemed on their mind. One was to preserve the country, but the other was to grow it in a way that would make it a great country. And Laurier was the man of the hour, for sure.
Yeah, you see, when he came in, he felt the greatest challenge was keeping pace with the United States. After the U.S. Civil War, when slavery had been abolished, the growth of the U.S. was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. It almost tripled its population from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of World War I, from 34 million to 91 million. And all through the 1880s, they put up growth rates of 8%. And this wasn't a developing economy like China in recent years. At the start of the period, they were neck and neck with Germany and Britain as the greatest economy in the world. It was a powerhouse when it started on this cycle, and it just grew in a way the world had never seen before. And Canada, the challenge was to keep pace with that. We couldn't compete with the Americans for publicity or the world's attention or influence, but we had to keep pace with it, or we really were going to become insignificant. And Sir Wilfrid and his immigration minister, though that was not his title, Sir Clifford Sifton, devised this tremendously innovative plan for recruiting immigration all around Europe, from the British Isles all the way into Russia. And they raised the number of immigrants to a higher proportion of the population than the United States had, and managed to regain the former ratio of population between the two countries. In 1912, it was a year after Laurier left office, but still his policy, we had a population of a little under 7 million and introduced 412,000 immigrants. That'd be like receiving 4 million immigrants in this country in 1 year. Now, it was tremendously ambitious, and it worked.
They had no doubt, presumably now, that working with the French, a great country was possible. Do you think they could be accused of being sluggish in throwing off the velvet cords of the British Empire, though? Could they have, before World War I, perhaps have demanded that independence we gained only after the blood of the fields of France and Belgium?
Well, I do, but I am, Brian, we are speaking from the luxurious deck chairs of a century later. But yes, obviously I'm not anti-British, as you could all tell by my heavy British accent. I am, after all, a member of their parliament. But Canada was not under threat, and that Canada would wish to support Britain is perfectly understandable and absolutely commendable, and it was not just supporting Britain, it was supporting ideals that the Western Allies stood for. The British and the French represented democracy opposite Germany. But and all those who wanted to volunteer, obviously, the government was right to encourage them and right to support them. But the answer to your question, my judgment is yes. I mean, Sir Robert Borden was a very fine man, but he was snowed by Lloyd George. Now, it's like you used to live in Britain. I mean, Lloyd George was a crafty operator, and he was known as the Welsh Wizard. He snowed almost everybody for a while. But, he was the prime minister even when 4/5 of his parliamentary supporters were not in his party. But he set up this war cabinet that didn't actually do anything. It was a talking shop. And he satisfied the Commonwealth leaders that they had an important role in decision-making, but they didn't. But the fact is, I have to say that Sir Wilfrid tried to found the Canadian Navy and set it up, start a naval academy, set up Canadian shipyards, train Canadian naval officers and naval crews, and just get a navy going. And Borden won the election, and instead of that, he just gave money to the British to build British ships in British yards, put British sailors and officers on them, and what did we get out of it? Borden was a very fine man, and he was a very sincere man and a good war leader. I don't want to denigrate him, but in my opinion, the answer to your question is yes. I mean, respect for the British, yes. Paying them back for protecting us, despite certain lapses, yes. But that degree of deference, in my judgment, was excessive.
That war record was quite amazing. I think we've had a year now of commemoration, so we all pretty well know what a remarkable feat Canada pulled off. But it was still only in 1919 that we were struggling a bit to get a full independence as a country. And
well, remember, Brian, we had only one diplomatic mission abroad, and that was a High Commissioner in London. In 1920, it was agreed by the British that Canada would set up its own minister in Washington. And at that time, 3/4 of the activities of the British Embassy in Washington, which is the biggest embassy the British had in the world, was Canadian business. Well, we shouldn't have had Canadian business being handled by the British at that point. By the way, Lloyd George actually offered Borden the position of British ambassador in Washington, and Borden was tempted to take it. But he didn't feel well enough.
well, he had business in Canada after he got independence. And in case any of you were really wondering, I want to let you know that when he left France to come back to Canada, Borden sailed on RMS Aquitania, 100 feet longer, 10,000 tons heavier, a deck taller, but 4 knots slower than the Mauretania on May 19th.
I am being mocked. But the reason I put that in is those of you who saw the movie Titanic will remember that when they arrived at the pier, that appalling man that the leading actress was engaged to made these points about the Titanic opposite the Mauretania, and I thought I just threw it in for the hell of it. You know?
Canada, unfortunately, we have to compress a lot, so we're into King now, and Canada's Second World War performance, and the years after the Second World War, when it's a different kind of Canada that sort of emerges. Can you sort of encapsulate some of the doubts you had about King, what you've since found out about him, and how you
about Mr. King?
Yeah. I mean, frankly, we thought he was nuts when we were younger.
Well, not exactly nuts, but eccentric. But and Brian, in fairness, I am on balance an admirer of his, and I think he was a great prime minister also. But
That's true.
I only have read one review of this book, but in it I was taken to task for suggesting that King was strange because of his spiritualism. Well, let me be clear. I respect everyone's religion or lack of religion, whatever their views are. But when the prime minister of the country in the midst of wartime writes 17 pages in his diary about the death of his dog and writes how he has sent messages of love with the dog into heaven for not only for his parents and for Sir Wilfrid Laurier and Lady Laurier, but for people that, in fact, Mr. King personally never laid eyes on, including Mr. Gladstone. I defy anyone here to tell me it isn't a bit strange. I mean, I like my wife's dogs, you know, and I respect spiritual matters within reason, but I still say it's strange. But to answer your question, the problem he had, I think, was that he was not an inspiring leader, and in wartime, that is exactly what you need. His talents, and they were great talents, were the talents of maneuver and compromise, making the Canadian system work, gradually improving relations with the British and the French and the Americans, and raising Canadian sovereignty all the time. And he did it. He signed the first treaty that Canada made as an independent country in 1923. Shocking it was that late on in our life as an autonomous country, but he didn't. It was about halibut fisheries, which sounds absurd, but it was quite a big business at that time. And at the end of his very long time as prime minister, we were charter members of the United Nations. We were joining NATO. He was very cordial with both the presidents of the U.S. whom he knew and the prime ministers of Britain. If any of you go to Laurier House, where Sir Wilfrid and Mr. King lived for a total of 50 years, you'll see the autographed photographs signed over to McKenzie King of 10 consecutive American presidents. And he would not have us just automatically at war when Britain was at war, as happened in 1914. Mm-hmm. Canada was designated a neutral country for about 10 days until he convened Parliament and declared war. And he made it clear from the start that participation would be voluntary only. He was not going to have the sort of rending battle within the country about the imposition of the English majority on the French to force conscription, because in the Second World War, as in the First, we were not directly under attack. And he did produce the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan that was, again, of a massive scale, trained 100,000, over 100,000 people from all around the Commonwealth, and some Americans, to be pilots and air crews of warplanes. And he was a very capable war leader. But as I said, I mean, those, perhaps the more venerable among you remember this, but certainly my parents, and I'm sure yours, always said, in the war, when we wanted inspiration, we listened to Mr. Churchill and Mr. Roosevelt. They spoke every other week, and they were great speakers. We didn't listen to King for inspiration. And that was the problem he had.
I have to rush off, because of the territory to cover. But the years after the war, a new kind of Canada emerges on the world. It's one that sort of irritates you at times. There are certain aspects of the Canadian character that begin to emerge that annoy American secretaries of state and the like. Could you?
Brian is referring to Dean Acheson, whose mother was Canadian. Those of you who know the York Club up at the corner of St. George and Bloor, that was his grandfather's house. The Goodrum family, they were in the distilling business. And indeed, some of you would remember Dean Acheson followed General Marshall as President Truman's Secretary of State, and his name was Dean G. Acheson, and G was for Goodrum, and he knew Canada well. And he always took us holidays here in the summer. And he said, as Brian noted, the Canadian diplomats that he met were always, as he put it, arm-flapping moralists. And his view, and Truman's view, and up to a point President Eisenhower's view, was that the Canadians were very good, but they were so full of goodwill and so inexperienced at dealing directly with truly horrible regimes like Stalin's, that they put too much faith in peacekeeping, reasonable, good faith negotiating. They didn't understand that you would get fairly quickly to a point where the only thing that counted was force and the ability to use it. And unfortunately, that was true. Now, with that said, I think once the Canadians sort of got on board with this, they were quite good, and sometimes it worked well, but not at times of maximum confrontation. I mean, there was a great deal of fussing around when the Korean War began, that Mr. Pearson saying it must be a United Nations action, must be called a police action. Finally, President Truman said, you know, Mike, if you think you're going to repel 10 North Korean divisions armed to the teeth by Stalin and Mao Zedong with a police action, you're not living on the same planet I am.
But we must move to the next door opening on the great leadership or disputed leadership, when the Diefenbaker, Pearson, Trudeau time comes along. Both of us were in the House often during those periods in Ottawa. We look back on Diefenbaker and Pearson with smiles. We smile when we hear their names because they were such extraordinary battles they had. They were amazing. And then there came the freshening moment of Trudeauism, when Trudeau-mania hit the country.
Yeah, I'm not sure that was the moment of truth, Brent.
No, I know you have views about that, but could we move to Trudeau, perhaps?
Sure. Because
many people would regard you as somebody who has been quite critical in recent years of Trudeau. But in fact, you were a Liberal at the time. You were
yeah. But as you know, I knew him, and I rather liked and admired him.
And you were, I think I remember, you supporting the Liberal Party quite often then. But historically now, you look back and at least give him some applauded, said he hasn't been getting much of these days.
Well, I can't comment on how he's treated. Now, my impression is he's still quite a respected figure, and he certainly deserves to be. But as you know, we lived in Quebec at the time that he became the Liberal leader and the Prime Minister. And I lived in Quebec and went to a French university, and we owned some French newspapers in Quebec. And I used to see a lot of these separatists at the street level, and they were no prize, as you know, and I was seriously alarmed as a Canadian what was going on, and I thought that Trudeau was a great thing. He was a sincere federalist, and he could sell the virtues of federalism as a competing vision to, and you have to understand that to a Quebecois, particularly one who's not comfortable in English, the idea of an independent Quebec has a certain appeal. I mean, it's got the resources and the population to be an independent country, certainly. And Trudeau had to compete with this, and he had to do it in a democratic way. He couldn't just suppress them like Franco suppressing the Catalonians in Spain or something. And so I rather admired him. And I always, I never bought into this theory that it was a terrible outrage that all the packaging was bilingual. And I thought it was a manifestation of Trudeau's genius when that man heckled him out west about how upset he was at seeing French in his cornflakes box, and Trudeau said, "Well, just turn the box around." but I mean, fine, maybe it is a waste of money to have French television in Prince Rupert, British Columbia, or English television in Chicoutimi, Quebec, but that's not the point. If you've got two official languages, a certain extravagance to make that a real fact by making both languages accessible, not compelling everyone to learn both of them, certainly, is justifiable and was necessary. And look, the transfer payments were very irritating at times, and they were often abused. They were very extravagant, and they got mixed up in outright political, vote buying. But the fact is, it was necessary to sell federalism in Quebec, and it worked. And I thought that, on balance, we have to evaluate Trudeau as somebody who entered public life to protect and enhance and advance federalism, was raised to the position of Justice Minister and then Prime Minister to do that, and he did it. That's what he was there to do. It was the greatest, and in this, the co-chairman of the Biculturalism and Bilingualism Commission, Laurendeau and Dunton, were right. It was the greatest crisis Canada ever faced, and he won that. And I give him great homage for that, and we should all be grateful for it. In other respects, I don't think he was a particularly good Prime Minister, but that's not the issue. He wasn't there particularly to build better roads or even improve the health.
He elevated the mood of the country, though.
Sorry?
I traveled with him on his first election campaign and saw Trudeau mania evolve. He definitely elevated the mood of a country, and it was an exciting time.
Yeah, well, and he was a bit of a star. Not as much as Canadians thought, but people took note of him in the world.
Shouldn't a leader get praise in the end for being able to put a country in a good mood as opposed to a narrow, nasty, coldish mood? Which we've seen
but did you have the impression, and I've just given something of a spiel in Trudeau's favor here, but do you have the impression that he actually put the country in a good mood? I was always surprised at how much people disliked him in places.
The country was in a good mood as long as the good mood of the 60s lasted, which was about 2 years.
Yeah.
From 67, 68, and then all hell breaks loose everywhere.
And he aggravated it with some completely outrageous things like his energy program and so on. He really... He had this, in that French phrase, the fault of his qualities, in the same measure that he was courageous and didn't much care what people thought. He really could be fairly annoying because of his ostentatious lack of interest in what they thought.
I wish I could pick that up, but I don't have time. We move now from a plateau of great figures we've talked about, stepping over some that we should have mentioned, to the era of Mulrooney, Chrétien, and Harper, the age of Harper. Because I got that from a play once where there's a line, we're in the age of Hooper. they were great, in many ways, interesting leaders. You don't mark them very poorly at all.
No,
but
there's
it's as if something's now missing. Now we're into that same Canadian golden thread we seem to be following. Do you find now that, though you're very big on Mulroney, you thought he was quite good?
Well, he had his limitations, but Brian tried. He I think deserves credit for free trade. I think it's worked. I think he was right. And this is not a issue with any political sex appeal, but he got onto the GST and he realized that the way to reduce the deficit was certain types of sales and transaction taxes that were voluntary, elective spending, not babies' clothing or food bought in grocery stores or something like that. And the way to stimulate the economy was to reduce income taxes. And it seems obvious today, except it doesn't seem to occur to the present government, but that, in fact, was right. He was right. And he tried. Look, I didn't think Meech Lake was such a brilliant agreement because I do not believe that every province should have a veto. I think it's nonsense. That just means utter sclerosis. You're never going to get unanimity. But he tried, and he almost got it through. And I give him credit for trying. But he repaired the damage, frankly, that Trudeau did in the world with his harebrained foreign policy. I mean, I know that many Canadians thought that he was too servile to the Americans, but he wasn't. He took issue with Reagan over the Nicaraguan Contras, which by the way, I disagreed with him. I thought Reagan was right, but that's not the point. He wasn't servile. He knew that in those days, with the Cold War still going on, the only way Canada could have any influence would be to be perceived to have influence with the United States, and he did. Next to Thatcher, Brian Mulroney was the foreign leader that Reagan listened to, and Reagan himself told me that.
And was great in some foreign affairs, aid to Ethiopia, the fight against apartheid in South Africa. He lobbied the White House very hard.
He did.
Chrétien, you had a few harsh words at times with Chrétien. In fact, you're now entering a part where you begin part of the war, the sort of Chrétien era national post wars, where you're remembered as a publisher of a newspaper that often criticized Chrétien in certain areas. And
rather gently compared to the Gomery Commission.
That's right. Okay.
But
you also give him not bad marks.
Look, my differences, we got on like smoke for 25 years, but we did indeed have some differences. But by the way, if I saw him today, I think it would be perfectly fine. As far as I'm concerned, it would. But that's, and from some of the things he's publicly said, I believe that would be reciprocal. But that's not the point. I'm trying to write history here, Brian. What disagreements I had with Chrétien are neither here nor there. They're not historically important, and I didn't refer to them. And they did not color my judgment of him, which is very positive. I think he was a distinguished Prime Minister.
That's what I was trying to draw out, the distinguished part. But I wanted to set up this sort of negative first, sort of dramatic balance. Harper is somebody many people would have expected you to be over the moon enthusiastic with. But in fact, you see some flaws in an era in which something seems to be missing to you in that golden thread.
I think he's been quite good, but my fear now is that it's a government that's completely risk averse and has run out of steam and has no imagination. And it just looks like they're remaining in office because they like being in office. And that is the sort of thing that historically leads to the irresistibility of the "it's time for a change" argument. I mean, he won his majority. In fairness to him, he had to put two parties together to get there, the Reform and Progressive Conservatives. He did it. He's led them in 4 elections. They've done better in 4 consecutive elections. 3 of them, he was the prime minister after the election. I mean, not even Franklin D. Roosevelt did better for 4 times in a row. He won 4 times in a row, but not always with a bigger majority. And yet, as a majority government, I think it's been not bad, but rather unimaginative. And there are all kinds of things that could be done fiscally. We now have in Quebec the most emphatic federalist premier since Jean Lesage 50 years ago, who is clearly ready to make a deal to finish the whole Meech Lake, Charlottetown, amending formula, patriation, the whole business. And it needs to be finished. You can't go on forever like this. And Harper's, for all I know, he may be negotiating in private, which is the way to do it. He shouldn't be doing it in public. But his public line is constitutional reform is off the table because the Supreme Court said that he would have to consult the provinces if he wanted to abolish the Senate. Well, any informed person in this country from the age of 16 up would have told him that. He didn't have to go to the Supreme Court for that. Of course you have to consult the provinces. It's a federal institution. He knows that. And I just don't like this business of being in the business of avoiding controversial things. I mean, that's not what he's paid to do. But with that said, I think he's been quite good up to now.
But you do mention that we seem now as a country to not be in an age of great visions and great enterprises the way we have in the past.
I would say that's fair at this point, yes.
We aren't. But we need to be.
I mean, I don't think that's the population's ready for it, but I don't think the leadership is doing it right now.
Okay. I'm going to go to the audience very shortly, so I just want to throw a couple of very quick response questions at you. Best and worst, that is most irritating characteristics of Canada and Canadians.
Best
and worst
characteristics. Canadians are, I think, the most tolerant and welcoming people in the world to immigration of all kinds, and in general are comparatively open-minded and tolerant people. And I think it's a very fine characteristic.
Worst characteristic?
A slight tendency to complacency and excessive blandness to a fault, you know?
Is it we're bland, or the rest of the world just is inherently incapable of paying attention to Canada?
There's some of that, too.
For some reason.
But we could get their attention, and not by doing silly things, or as they say in Washington, stupid stuff.
Great vision missed. What might we have had as a great vision that we missed, perhaps?
The Canadians now, not British acting for us.
No.
Okay.
In our time, since Macdonald.
Look, even today, I think there's a tremendous potential receptivity for a revitalization of virtually all international organizations. United Nations, NATO, IMF. Canada has an excellent position from which to make such suggestions, and we have the people who could do it. And we're not doing it. I mean, the fact is NATO is a shambles. It was the most successful alliance in history. We had a good alliance background, and it degenerated into an alliance of the willing, which in practice meant that everybody would allow the Americans the great privilege of guaranteeing their borders, but they would only join with the Americans when it pleased them to do it, which was not very often. And now it's down to even less than that. And Canada, I think, could take a lead in suggesting a modernization of that alliance. The United Nations started with great hopes, as we know, and we also know that much of it is perversely mismanaged in a way that's just gratuitously annoying to the people who pay most of the bills. Now, and it should be reformed.
It can be reformed.
Well, I'm not saying it would be like falling off a log, but you got to start by trying to do it. You can't. You can either try or give up without trying, and I think we should try.
In terms of vision and direction, you hosted Henry Kissinger here a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying, well, here, that one of the things that struck him about leaders today was, unlike those of the past, they seem to not have that same sense of history. And he believes firmly that for any strong leader in any country, that leader has to have a strong historical sense of the society they represent.
Both history and geography. He's afraid that neither is the case. I mean, he's not saying no leader in the world. I mean, let's face it, he was basically talking about Obama and Kerry and Chuck Hagel. You know?
But it is something that the media sometimes frets about, and that is how earnest our leaders today think of the big picture, the long term, the historical, rather than the short term. We have 3,500 public relations officers working for the government in Ottawa. That's a sign of a country that has a very low attention span.
By the way, one thing about Henry Kissinger, he did say that the first time he was ever in Toronto, he came and spoke at a dinner that I had in the 70s, and no, in 1981, I'm sorry, that was the first time he was here, and he said that this was an absolutely unimaginably more impressive city now than it was then, and it wasn't a bad city then. So
that's pretty good. Anyways, I want to end my portion here on a bit of an update because we've been talking about Canadian successes. And you wrote a few paragraphs at the end of your book. I won't say long book. It's a short little book. In which you sort
pamphlet.
Which you sort of sum up your feelings of looking ahead now from the Canada we've passed through.
Are you asking me to read this?
If you would.
I want you to understand this isn't staged. I didn't ask for the...
And I should just mention before you do, it's time to line up for questions, those of you who have questions. And again, I'll ask you in advance to keep those questions very short. That'd be just great. And Conrad, this is your final...
This is the end of the book.
End of the book.
The passage is, once again and once more by a narrow margin, the country is passing out of crises, Quebec separatism and American psychological domination. History is almost always a guide, and again the ambitious, if often imprecise, plans of the builders of this country throughout its history, which have evolved and moved on to ever higher stages, will take Canada to a new summit of national development. Canada always seemed to survive precariously, almost inexplicably, and even accidentally. But this has made its progress more ineluctable until it finally, suddenly, has metamorphosed into a strong country. It advanced in almost imperceptibly small increments, a gentleman's agreement on a few hundred immigrants with Japan in 1907, a halibut treaty in 1923, the King-Roosevelt Defense Agreement at Ogdensburg in 1940, abolition of appeals to the UK Privy Council in 1949, but it never stopped advancing. It is the chief contention of this book that for more than 400 years, there has been a continuous thread of genius and determination to create and build and improve an original and distinguished political society in the northern half of this continent. The thread has almost snapped many times, but has never been severed. Though Canada's progress has often seemed to be a freakish sequence of usually trivial events, only rarely punctuated by anything grand and dramatic, it has been invincible. The past reveals the future.
Perfect. That is nice. To the floor.
Thank you very much for your commentary. I'm looking forward to reading your book, and I think many of us would agree that it's a great source of pride that you paint such a positive picture of Canada as a country. I haven't read your book yet. Like I said, I'm looking forward to reading it, so I'm basing my question based on reviews. I wonder how you would respond to the criticism that your history of Canada ignored or circumvented or glossed over the nature of the contribution or the role that First Nations played in both the creation and the evolution of Canada. How do you respond to that?
When it's phrased like that, I respond with great solicitude to make it clear to you that I don't underestimate their role. Some people in the last couple of weeks have phrased it a good deal less diplomatically than that, and they impute motives to me that are unjust and indeed quite extreme, which is preposterous. I want to put this very carefully. I make it clear in this book that I absolutely do not underestimate or disparage in any way the Native people. And I make it clear that I think they've been shabbily treated, and that there is great room to try and make amends to them. And I couldn't, I think, be more emphatic on that point. But I also make it clear that I dissent from a romanticization of the sophistication of the civilization that they had when the Europeans arrived here. The fact is, they had not invented the wheel. It was a Stone Age culture. They were tremendously adept at various things, handicrafts, making canoes and things. I mean, very important. They were very talented. But it wasn't a sophisticated civilization, and only about 10% of them had any sense of agriculture. They were essentially nomads who didn't have fixed structures, and they were terribly skilled at it. That's not the issue. But it wasn't a sophisticated civilization, and they were terribly violent. Many of them were constantly at war for no particular purpose, and their definition of war, and goodness knows, war in the 17th and 16th centuries in Europe could be a pretty grim business, and it still is, but it was particularly grim then. But with the native people, they routinely captured civilians, women and children, and tortured them to death. And it really was not, in my opinion, a civilization that deserves the romanticization that writers like James Fenimore Cooper and Chateaubriand, for example, have given it. But that absolutely is not a disparagement of the native people. I have great admiration for them, and I think they've been treated outrageously, and they've got no more militant advocate of better treatment, by which I don't mean condescendingly. I mean better treatment out of respect for them than I am. That's my response.
Next question.
Thanks for taking my question. In your book, and again, I haven't read it either, but read some of the reviews, you talk about the visionaries that Sir John A. and Wilfrid Laurier and so on, and I think the word that you used to describe Mr. Harper was bland. So I'm wondering, of the current sort of leaders in maybe G8, G20, G7, who do you see as those people who are visionary in the current context?
Canadian political leaders today?
Well, we don't have one because he's bland, right?
Well,
So
I didn't say. By the way, I didn't say Harper was that bland. I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think he's
We were
quite
bland.
Hmm?
You said we were bland.
Yeah. I mean, I think I wouldn't say.
okay,
Harper's
well, I
particularly
apologize
bland.
then because then I
I
misheard.
mean,
but
he's no barrel of laughs, but I wouldn't say.
all right, barrel of laughs.
So you're asking me who are the visionaries who are out there now?
Who are out there now? Like, who do you think are out there now? Like, of anybody? Like, take the G20 because that's 20 guys or 20 people that you could pick from. Like, who's sort of got it going on right now?
Of the G20, the best of them, I think, are the new leaders in India and Indonesia. This man, Modi, the Prime Minister of India, is the first one-party parliamentary majority in 30 years, and he produced a 10% annual growth rate in Gujarat, a state of 60 million, for 14 years. And his mandate is to do for India what Thatcher did for Britain. And if he does it, India will pass China as an economic power. And the Yodo, I'm not going to say his full name because I won't pronounce it properly, and I find all Indonesian names sound a little odd in English, but the new Prime Minister of Indonesia is quite different from the past. He's a genuine democratic figure. He's not a general, and he's not someone who's an economic royalist, a prominent baron of industry. And I think they're both very promising, and they are the second and fourth most populous countries in the world. But in Canada, because of the way it works, it's hard to judge. But I suspect, for example, that Jason Kenney is something of a visionary. I think his handling of immigration was very intelligent. And I don't know him well, but my guess would be that if he had the scope, he would be quite imaginative. For the Liberals, this woman, I may not pronounce her name right, but she's the shadow foreign minister, Vreeland, I think her name is, something like that.
Yeah.
Is that her name?
Freeland.
Freeland, yeah. She seems to me, from what I've seen, and Garneau, the former astronaut, I mean, he's a bit stiff in his presentation, but I think they're both quite interesting. And I'm sure there are others. I just don't know all the politicians that well. I used to know them better. I know the British ones better.
Well, some of us here has to ask, Justin Trudeau? Or would you?
Well, look, he's a very charming, impressive man when you meet him. I mean, I don't know him well, but look, I understand the temptation to say that he doesn't have a very impressive CV and that he's, it's nepotism. But the fact is, he's leading the polls, and he's got an appeal. And to speak with him, he's not an unimpressive guy to speak with. I mean, he's not like his father, but he's frankly more charming than his father. But although
That's true, actually.
his father was very entertaining at times. But I'm not qualified to say how capable he is. I don't want to. I mean, I understand there is a concern about his gravitas. We don't know, and I think we'll have to watch him closely during the campaign. But I'll say this. I did listen to Michael Enright's interview with him, most of it, for an hour a couple of weeks ago. And none of that was staged, and the questions weren't softball questions, and he was very good. So I wouldn't sell him short.
Thank you very much.
Just before the next question, I should mention that the book will be on sale, the table at the back, and Conrad will be signing copies.
Hi, my name's Alex. I have a media question. The Guardian in 2012 scoffed at the idea that you were making a media comeback, and you had told the Huffington Post that you saw potential in Canadian newspapers.
I'm sorry, that I did what?
That you saw potential in Canadian newspapers. And I was just wondering, do you still see that potential? And are you making a media comeback?
Did I understand you to say at the start that the Guardian scoffed at something or other?
Well, they were saying that you must
The
have been
Guardian has
joking.
scoffed at almost anyone I had any respect for, any idea I had any regard for the last 40 years. So that's not a litmus test to me. But I know what they're referring to. What I said was that I thought some newspaper titles were now undervalued. Some newspaper companies that are publicly traded, so you can judge their capitalization, are undervalued compared to what could be done with those franchises. There's an enormous amount of goodwill in many of these trademarks of great newspaper names. It's a matter of using them right. I think the newspaper industry has responded inexcusably slowly, with very few exceptions, to both the challenges and the opportunities of the internet era. And I'm looking forward to seeing what Jeff Bezos, who is a brilliant man, as well as a very nice man, what he does with the Washington Post. So I think if you could do things with some of these newspapers, but whether I would be the one to do it, it all depends what opportunities come up. I'm not aware of any at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Black, I have a question for you today, and it is this. In all of your life experience, both personal and business thus far, is it your opinion that any person or persons making decisions affecting the lives of millions of people should always consider a power far greater than themselves to stability and survival? And if you agree, why? And if you don't, why not? Now, this question might well pertain to your former book on leadership, Good, Better, Best Categories. This is not a religious question. I'm asking you this as a Canadian inventor.
I don't think it is my place to say what people should do. It's like when people ask my investment advice, I wouldn't give them any. What I'm prepared to do, if I know them at all, is say what I'm doing, but that doesn't mean I'm advising them to do it. I don't think it's for me to say what where people should get their inspiration. I would go this far, that I think there's an unlimited number of routes to gaining the kind of inspiration that, or if I understood you correctly, that you're speaking of. One is the greater power, whatever your phrase was, and I'm certainly a respecter of that, and indeed up to a point a practitioner of it myself. But there are other ways of doing it. But I certainly would agree with you that if you're an inventor, you have a lot of lonely, difficult moments when your morale and confidence are challenged. We all do, but an occupation like yours would be particularly susceptible to that, I think. And I think if that is where you were seeking your inspiration, I don't think you're putting a step wrong.
Yes, well,
We should, sorry, limit it to one question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, if I could just say this. Inventors always look to process method solution. So process means you have to deal with what you're dealing with. That's the only thing that I was concerned about.
Yeah, well,
thank you for your...
I think we all have to do that.
Yes, thank you, Mr.
Not a
Black.
bit.
Thank you for this evening. The question I have is moving forward into the 21st century. During election periods, especially in the States with all the money and the Electoral College, do you think the voting system this past the post, which I still have trouble trying to wrap my head around, should be revamped or changed, or because
No, I don't believe in proportionate voting. I could go this far. I think the French system, and it's used in some other countries, of where there isn't a majority, having a runoff between the top two candidates, I think you can justify that. But if you get into proportional voting, you get absolute chaos. Everybody's a party. It's just a shambles like Israel. I'm not saying Israel as a country's a shambles, but the Israeli Knesset is a Tower of Babel. And they've tried to restructure it, but the Israelis are remarkable people, but they're very argumentative and they're not easy to organize. And so I wouldn't touch proportionate voting. Every third party in the world is for it, but that is a good reason not to do it.
I think we got a long signing to go, so if we had one quick question and one quick answer, and I think we can head for the signing table.
Okay, so you've written about the U.S. and Canada, but what's next?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
So you've written about the U.S. and Canada, like in your books.
Yes.
What's next?
In Canadian-American relations?
Yeah, like if you could write another book, or
I
if you
see.
are writing another book,
Look,
what's it going to be on?
I've relaunched my commercial career, and I can't do another big book like this. You'll be relieved to hear for a while. So I'm going to give the readers and the promoters of these tours and people like you and myself a rest here for a while. But I think the next one would, I like writing about countries more than individuals, because you can work in as much as you want about any individual and you're writing about the country.
Great.
Here's one minute.
Very quick, I was just wondering, Paul Johnson mentioned you delivered very quickly on this project. How long did it take you?
Well, longer than Paul implied. Writing it took only about a year, but preparing the material, it took a couple of years, and Paul advised me to do it. He may not remember, but he started advising me to do it about 25 years ago. I think he's forgotten the early times that he did, because the circumstances were a bit blurry for reasons that I won't go into.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to help me thank Brian Stewart and Conrad Black for a really wonderful conversation. I invite all of you to get a book signed, and Mr. Black can perhaps answer a few more questions. Thanks so much.
Oh, sure.